speaker today is Dr. Trembanis from the University of Delaware. He's in the Department of Geosciences within the College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment at Delaware. He's got his bachelor's degree in geology from Duke University and went on to get a PhD in marine science from William and Mary. He did a postdoc with the USGS at Hui, and he was also a Fulbright scholar at Sydney University in Australia. And so I actually know Art because when I was an undergrad, I studied abroad in New Zealand, and he was one of my professors in New Zealand. And we actually got to play with some really cool stuff like AUVs and ROVs while we were in New Zealand, and he's going to show some cool AUV data today. So welcome, Art.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Thank you. It's great to be here. Yeah, I understand I'm the anchor talk of the seminar series. I was once the anchor talk at an AGU meeting. It was me, the session chair, and the guy in the back waiting to clean up the room. So it's a much better turnout, so I appreciate you being here. It's the end of the semester. I know there's a lot of distractions. Luckily, this is a nice excuse for me. I got to cancel my class of 230 today and gave my last lecture that on Wednesday. And yeah, so I'm really delighted to be up for my first time out on Long Island and here in Stony Brook. So thank you for having me. Today I'm going to present, I'm going to present a little bit of a kind of a cook's tour of some of the work that we do in my lab. But then also I want to focus on some recent work that we've been doing on the inner shelf and some things that we've been seeing that we saw from the impact of Hurricane Sandy. And this is kind of a combination of employing the Boy Scout motto of being prepared. It's an area we've been working. We actually had a planned crew, and then getting really lucky when it comes for storms. And I don't mean to be flippant about that, but I mean, when you study coastal processes like I do, then you want to have a big event to study those, and we did luck out in that regard with Sandy. So I'm going to present some of that, and this is ongoing collaboration work with primarily funding from ONR and also grew out of a Sea Grant project. Myself, Larry Merripp at UNH, Doug Miller, who's a benthic ecologist at Delaware that I work with, Jonathan Bodwin, who's a mapping expert up at UNH, and several grad students of mine have been working and are working on this area. Carter Duvall, master's student, Trevor Metz, another master's student. And really what I'm going to present to you today grows out of two recent PhD students of mine, kind of combining the work. Nicole Reynaud, she's now at URI, postdoc, and Adam Skarke, who's now up with NOAA. And so let's get into it. Just to kind of give you a roadmap, I'll give you a little bit of background, just some images to keep in mind. If you drain out, I'm be talking about an area that's turned into an artificial. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Turned into an artificial reef site with sunken ships, and these are New York City subway cars. You don't need a ticket on these anymore. These are the Redbird line. So I'll introduce you to a little bit of the research we do in my group. I'm a geologist and a physical scientist by training, so I focus on coastal processes, and I bounce between the beach and the offshore. And we'll look at this Redbird site, and take a look at the storm dynamics, particularly from Hurricane Sandy, and look at how we've been applying some new image processing techniques using fingerprint, basically borrowing techniques from the FBI to do fingerprint analysis to look at ripples as fingerprints of the seabed. Okay. So we kind of jump around the globe doing a bunch of different things. The stuff I'll be talking about today is primarily an outgrowth of recent Sea Grant and ONR project work for combining sort of benthic habitat mapping and also seafloor morphology and dynamics. But a number of other recent projects we've been involved in that I won't have time to go into today, but I thought I'd just give a couple of quick little highlights on it. I think overall I want to let you know, which is probably obvious, is that we're living in an exciting time for ocean exploration, ocean mapping work, and that's because of what I consider to be two big revolutions going on. One is we're living in the age of robotics. When I was growing up playing with the original Transformers, they told us we'd have robots in the future. Now we have robots that vacuum our floors. Anybody have or know somebody with a Roomba? Wow, okay, well, so yeah, most every time I ask at least one or two people. So I like to say any job that's worth not doing is worth having a robot do for you. And we can send them to places, have them do things that are dirty, dull, dangerous, and daring, which we used to have to just let graduate students do. But now we have, there's more paperwork when you lose a graduate student, believe me, I've done that. So, It's just, and you can get robots insured more easily than you can students. So this is our robot, one of our robots. Actually, we've now increased our fleet. Mark Moline is the new school director in Delaware. He brought 3 AUVs with him. Matt Oliver, who's down at the Lewis campus, he runs gliders. This is a propelled autonomous underwater vehicle. We've named ours Dora because at the time my now 8-year-old was into Dora the Explorer. So this is our Dora. She's done about over 140 missions and covered over 3,500 kilometers underwater for us. So she just keeps swimming and swimming and swimming. So basically, AUVs are platforms. They're pickup trucks for sensors, and we've seen quite a bit of development and maturation of that technology. So it's just really about what kind of configuration, what you want to do with those. So we live in this both this age of exploration, of robotic exploration. That's one of the revolutions. The other is the geospatial revolution, with GIS and information technology and spatial information. And the confluence of both of those is really blowing open the realm of and the kinds of questions and the kind of places we can go with ocean exploration and for me primarily seafloor mapping. One of the other platforms we use is remotely operated vehicles. We've added a recent system, an outlet ROV, just got back from Palau, and we use it. It's on a tether. The AUV is untethered, so the tethered robot allows us to get in and really prosecute targets, to maybe use a military description there. And then even some are real expensive, but we're also working on and developing new low-cost ones. So we've been involved with the Open ROV program. These are small, like $500 little kits that you can put together. So we have students put these together and then take them out. We took one down to Aquarius a couple years ago down off Key Largo. Walter Monk said that he said a bunch of things, but when he said famously at a keynote that the realm of I'm paraphrasing here, but that oceanography will become sterile unless we are continuously developing new sensors and techniques for exploring the ocean realm. And he went on to describe 20th century oceanography as largely being an activity in an undersampled environment. And Professor Monk should know he lived through most of 20th century oceanography. And I always tell my students, if you think you're doing something, chances are Walter Monk already published on it a long time ago. And so just accept that and move on. So we do a lot of work in technology development. I used to work in the AUV industry, and one of the systems that we're doing, and I had a nice time talking with Josie about this, is we developed a new system. This is work with Craig Carey, who's a genomicist with Delaware and at Waikato, develop a modular autonomous biosample. So we want to have a system that could sample and filter water samples and filtrates. We wanted to be able to work on AUVs and gliders, ROVs and moorings, full ocean depth, and 200 samples or more. So we finished the prototype last year, and now we're starting a new second phase of the NSF project to build 2 units, one standalone and one to go on an AUV. So some technology development. The biosamplers, more on the sort of pure science. An applied problem that we've been working on for the Department of Defense is unexploded ordnance. It was called UXO. There are a number of sites, target sites, World War II sites around the world in domestic waters, places off the Acas in Puerto Rico and the Pacific, that have lots and lots of unexploded ordnance, shells, mines, mortars, bombs, and whatnot. And these are going to require a lot of work to clean up. It's dangerous work to do, and so if it's dangerous, let a robot do it. So we've integrated a magnetometer sensor to actually go out and try to map and locate ferrous objects on the seabed, and we actually put inert ordnance on the seabed to try to test that system out. In the kind of exploration realm, recently we've been involved in a number of NASA-related projects, and actually it turns out one of the biggest users of the Aquarius lab down off Key Largo, which just got a new lease on life. Florida International has taken over management of that from UNC Wilmington. And NASA uses it because it's a great place to train astronauts. This goes back to work that was done in the Apollo program. They would take astronauts out to the desert and train them to be geologists. That was a better approach than training geologists how to be astronauts. I take slight umbrage at that, but that's okay. At Aquarius, you have a lot of the kinds of challenges that you would have in space. You know, life support systems are needed, weightless conditions, cramped environments. So it simulates a lot of the challenges of going to space. I think a lot of us who do ocean exploration say, well, the space folks got it easy. They have 1 atmosphere of pressure difference to deal with. We get 1 atmosphere every 10 meters. So we've been doing work there, trying to develop techniques for merging both manned and robotic systems for exploration. And in space, you use satellites to go out and explore first. Underwater, we take our AUV, and here's the shoulder launch version of the AUV, and we send it out to map over the reef, and then we send manned submersibles and divers out. And the great thing is that, well, I like to jokingly tease some of my astronaut friends and say that, you know, robots for dough, people for show. And the robots go out and they do what we tell them. They run very nice systematic lines. And then this actually, that precision, that systematic coverage allows us to do some exciting things. We recently were working on a project. This is some accent modeling that Doug Miller's just sent to me. All these white spots are where we found the giant barrel sponge, Justus spongia muta. So we can map where they are all around the reef. Folks who've been doing a lot of studies down there maybe study a dozen or a few hundred sponges. We identified over 8,000 sponges. So now we're looking at the whole forest, not just the trees, and we can size them, we can measure them, we can actually estimate their abundance and their filtering for the entire reef system. I kind of wear a coastal hat, and so we've been doing beach monitoring, especially inside Delaware Bay on these fetch-limited barriers. And so we've been monitoring before and after Sandy. We go out every month and map what the beach is like. Turns out you can do a lot of exploring, but not going very far. A couple years ago, we discovered a shipwreck about 150 yards off the beach at Cape Hamilton. This is the mouth of Delaware Bay. And a graduate student of mine who's an archaeology undergrad went through and matched up this ship to this wreck to the ship, the W.R. Grace, named after W.R. Grace, who was a former mayor of New York. The W.R. Grace company is still around, but at the time, this was a 215-foot-long, 3-masted ship. And it ran aground. It was pushed onto the beach in 1889 during a hurricane. So it was kind of a nice bookend to what I'll be talking about with Sandy. And it lay there unknown for a long time. NOAA came across it in 2007, decided not to put it on the charts, and then we found it independently in 2010, and then we figured out which one it was this past year. Another recent realm we've gotten involved with is fishery stock assessment. So we did a project a couple years ago looking at this scallop abundance. And so while I haven't been on to Long Island, I've worked offshore. A couple of summers ago, we did a number of sites just offshore. And when in a 10-day period, we ran like some 30 missions and gathered 250,000 images of the seafloor. This is an example of one here. Each of these green circles is where a sea scallop, Placopecten magellanicus, was found. And so we're actually counting the number of scallops on the seafloor. And because we know the height of the vehicle, we're actually measuring the size of those scallops. Traditionally, the sea scallop assessment had been done by dredging, and then more recently, the last 10 years or so, using towed camera systems. And this is we're using an untethered camera, the ability for the AUV to fly very close to the seafloor and get pictures, and also sonar pictures of the bed. And it may be a little difficult to see, but this whole area is crisscrossed with commercial scallop dredging on it. You're used to probably seeing just the adductor muscle on your plate, but that the vehicle allows us to precisely know where our images are taken, so we can start to look at patchiness of that distribution. And I just had a student just defended his master's thesis on this work on Tuesday. Well, when you gather 250,000 images, you got a problem. You got a problem in trying to process those. And while I knuckled down and I hired a crack team of students and they went through all 250,000 images, we thought, well, there's got to be some other ways to try to do this. And we've been working with some engineers to do automated detection of scallops. And it's tough because sand dollars throw systems off a lot. Turns out of that 250,000 images we collected, only 17,000 of them had scallops. So we have a 250,000 image problem. We really have a 17,000 image problem. It's how do we get down into that if you just want to look at at scallops. And it was all I could do to have my team just focus on scallops. So based on some work we've done with NASA and other folks before, a lot in the astronomy community has a very mature usage of citizen science. And so we developed a couple of programs over the years, most recently our website called Subsea Observers. And folks sign up, they go through a training period, unpaid volunteers from around the world. We've got folks from Philippines, France, Great Britain, US, different places. And since we opened in October, they've looked at 148,000 images for us. Actually, this is a couple days old. So, and we can then compare what the citizen scientists come up with to what the science team has seen. And one of the exciting things that citizen science work allows us to do is something that's really important to science, and that is replicants. So we can have multiple people look at it, and that allows us to look at to do quality assurance, quality control. So I can have 6 to 10 people look at the same set of images. If 9 of them all count 6 scallops, and somebody counts 80, I flag the one that says 80, and it turns out it's usually sand dollars or something. But the nice thing is that those folks who are working on it, they're learning about the seafloor and scallops in ways, so we have a nice outreach component of it. And then they're logging a lot of other information for us as well. So they're telling us something about the substrate. They're pointing out other species, which is really expanding our science. So I encourage you all, go check out Subsea Observers, sign up, tell your friends. It's fun. It's better than Angry Birds. Okay, it's not better than Angry Birds, but it contributes to more science. So if your advisor comes by, you can say, well, but I'm helping science. I'm going to get angry later if I say, they're spending time on Subsea Observers. So just some of our recent publications, and today I'm going to kind of focus on present some of the results and some stuff that is newer than these publications, but kind of building on the work from what Nicole and Adam did, and kind of combining habitat seafloor mapping with new techniques for looking at seabed ripples, which is kind of a passion of mine. So my kind of interest spans what we call the Morphodynamic Corridor. Morphodynamicist means I'm interested in morphology, and dynamics, dynamis, sort of power transition. Dynamics, waves, currents, moving sand around. We give it a fancy name we call morphodynamics. And morphodynamics encompasses this broad, what we call the morphodynamic corridor, and that goes from processes and phenomena on a very small scale, ripples, turbulence, all the way up to sort of formation of larger coastal lithosomes and stuff in between. And it's some of the exciting, interesting things in between, where we look at shipwreck scour or mine burial, or we look at ripple formation. But that's kind of where I'm going to focus on here today. My motivation is the fact that ripples, I want to kind of understand what are the dynamics of ripples on the seafloor of the inner shelf. And part of the reason for that is because that seabed roughness can be a real, contributes and interacts with benthic ecology. It influences sediment transport and wave transformation. And it's out of a recognition that over 80% of the world's sandy systems are heterogeneous. We go out and we see patches. It's not just fine sand everywhere. And often what we see are these bed forms or ripples on the seafloor. Ripples, bed forms, they're everywhere. This is a satellite image from Mars. So trying to understand bed forms on our planet helps us to understand dynamics and infer processes on other bodies as well. So just to give kind of a modeling reason for this, the Navy did a project off Duck, North Carolina, and they looked at trying to model wave transformation across the shelf. And here's what they observed here in blue. And if they didn't include bottom friction, well, the results weren't satisfactory. They had to include bottom friction. And that bottom friction in the inner shelf, where you have an overlap between the surface and the bottom boundary layer, the emitted core is gone. You have a frictionally dominated system. A lot of that roughness can come from seafloor ripples. So there's been a lot of work to try to predict and forecast and understand bed form dynamics. I mentioned when we look at it, we can see these very striking patterns. This is actually a site, so Laura, I am showing some New Zealand stuff. This is from a site off New Zealand, where we have this sharp contact that we see repeated on the shelf around the world with areas with large wave orbital ripples. These have wavelengths of about 1 meter or more and heights of 20 to 30 centimeters. These are existing in a seabed type that is very coarse sand with gravel and shell hash. And immediately next door, literally a diver, I mean, this is just 10 meters on either side. Within an arm's length away, you can find a very well-sorted fine sand. And these are occurring at the same depths, adjacent to each other, being exposed to the same waves and currents. So we kind of got interested in trying to understand. We used to call these rippled scour depressions. In the 80s, some folks in USGS started finding these off the west coast and called them rippled scour depressions. More recently, in literature, we started calling them sorted bed forms.
What's that? Excuse me. What's that vertical depression there?
Sorry, right along here?
Yeah, that.
Oh, that's just the center line from where the side scan is towed. So we're trying to remove that where the water column is, and I haven't removed it too terribly well. Yes. So I tried to sort of suture that together. You can see I wasn't too terribly sufficient. So this is this is 900 kilohertz, so very high frequency seismic. And the reason, and what we found is when we studied these and put hydrodynamic, we did put wave and current turbulence sensors over these beds, is that those coarse beds here have these large ripples, have a very thick wave boundary layer, and during storms they become activated, and these vortex ripples are shedding vortices on each forward and backstroke of a wave. That's exchanging momentum between above the wave boundary layer and in the water column, so it introduces an increased drag. You have enhanced turbulence over these beds, particularly during storms. What that means is that the adjacent fine sands, when they are more easily put in suspension. But during a storm, when those fine sands are being advected around by currents, the turbulence is too high over the coarse domains for them to settle. It's too hot. Okay, so they get advected by, and they'll deposit in areas adjacent that have fine sand. So it's a self-sorting mechanism. It was first, the theory for that was proposed by Murray and Thieler in 2003, and then 2004. I'm summarizing very, very quickly here. Results in a series of papers in continental shelf research where we actually demonstrated this mechanism at work and the dynamics between these two beds. It becomes much rougher over the coarse beds when the ripples get activated. On the fine sand beds, the bed forms, what small bed forms are there, get wiped out, and you form these either plain beds in a really strong storm or more hummocky beds. So I'll show you some examples. There's more detail there. So I should have had a picture of him in it. Well, I'm sure there's best fans. I was going to say maybe I should have him in his Yankee uniform or maybe both or something. But anyways, Yogi Berra said you can observe a lot just by watching. So from morphodynamics, we want to kind of take a look at that. So to do that, I'll show you a case study where we've been doing this off Delaware. So I've drained all the water out. I have some friends who work for Google Earth, and I tell them they really do themselves a bit of a disservice with this just blue, slight shading kind of monochrome stuff that if they actually colored the bathymetry, they'd show these beautiful, beautiful structures. Unfortunately, they respond back and they go, well, what color bar do we use? Do we go from the bottom of the Marianas Trench to the coast, in which case everything would be one color everywhere? Or do they do a couple of different color schemes or something? So we're still trying to encourage them to do that because I think there's a beautiful structure here. We drain out all the water from Delaware Bay. You can see some of the when it was at the peak of the last glacial maximum, it was a deeply incised river flowing out across the shelf. And as sea level rose, it left behind and the shoreline retreated landward and upward. Cape May used to be down here and retreated back this way. And it left behind a series of shoals that Don Swift called this the shoal retreat massif. So here we're focusing on the Cape May shoal retreat massif, and there's several up and down the system. So this was the ancestral Cape May, and what we're looking at is this artificial reef site. It's one of 13 that the state of Delaware operates. About 11 of them, 10 or 11 of them are inside. 10 are inside the bay. 11, 12, and 13 are outside. This one's referred to as the Redbird because of the subway cars. It's about 30 kilometers east of Indian River Inlet. As I mentioned, it's on this Cape May shoal retreat massif. So when you get samples up on the top of the massif, it's like samples you would get on the beach in Cape May because it was the ancestral Cape May. The exciting thing for us as a natural laboratory is they've been depositing reef artifacts there, not just at one time, but over a period of time from '96 into 2009, and including ships, barges, some tugboats, military track vehicles, tires, and almost 1,000 subway cars. Okay, and it happens to be over an area, it's called the Inner Mud Hole. It's an area that occupies a paleo tributary of the Delaware River. It's also an area where they're planning to build, that they have plans to do an offshore wind farm. So there's a lot of interest in this, and it's right between the two approaches to Delaware Bay. This is what it looks like. They took the old Redbird lines. Anybody ever ride the Redbird? So they stripped out all the interior stuff, and then they took them out on site and they pushed them over under the water. Some of them are upright, some are on their side, some are flipped upside down. They started doing the first subway cars in 2001 within this 1.3 nautical mile area. And it's to encourage, there's no commercial fishing allowed there, but it's basically designed to aggregate fish and encourage benthic organisms, give them some surfaces to grow on. And to encourage recreational anglers and also scuba divers. This is a photo from...
But isn't that in violation of the Ocean Dumping Ban Act?
I'd have to pass on that, but I think maybe not. But or nobody's charged him on it.
Where's Larry Swanson?
It's
But it must not be, because they do it all. I mean, we put coal waste blocks in. You know, there's a lot of reefs along the shore.
yeah. So what?
But they're still doing it. I mean, they're still doing the reefs.
Yeah, they're doing. They did a couple years ago. They put a Navy destroyer, the Arthur Radford, out. Then Hurricane Irene broke the bow off of it. That's a little further offshore. I think the last time they put objects out here was 2009. So we've got a site. We want to try to understand the morphodynamics. Means we've got to get the morphos part. So we do that with our mapping platforms. The two we've been using are AUV here on the left with a swath bathy side scan and a traditional side scan system and color camera, and the RV Sharp, which had last year a new Rezon 7125 multi-beam. And we're using a Knudsen sub-bottom profiler, 4.5 kilohertz, and then we're using graph samples. We measure the morphology with those, and then we measure the hydrodynamics by putting instruments on moorings on the seabed, upward-looking ADCP, downward-looking high-resolution pulse-coherent acoustic Doppler profiler, and then we use a rotary sonar to get time series sector scans of the seabed. Unfortunately, this flooded during Sandy, the rotary sonar. The other instruments work, so I'll show you some of that. So the AUV, we use its ability to get close to the seabed and do very precise line spacing. We can do line spacing as tight as 2 meters. We had to develop that just to do UXO work. And we can fly within a couple of meters of the seafloor. That's great because it allows us to get photos of the seabed. Here's 3 horseshoe crabs getting together. And here's a fish. And so we can see cobbles and boulders. These images are each about 2 meters across. So it's a big boulder from the paleo Delaware. It's also useful for us to be able to confirm what every physical oceanographer fears, and that is you deploy your mooring and it's upside down. This one we confirmed it was upright in its orientation. And then we can lay our images over the side scan, and I apologize if I blew this up more, you can actually see the ripples in the images, so we can overlay those. You can see this is a tire, we can see the treads on it. This is 1800 kilohertz side scan. This is from one of the tire deposits. And then what we see here, each of these little spots, these are the subway cars. Okay, the multi-beam of the ship, we really punish the skippers of the boat because we're asking them to drive 20-meter lines with a 150-foot long vessel. The robot doesn't complain about these things, but it's hard work for the captain. But they do a great job for us. And they were really accommodating, particularly because we had to try to get out right before Hurricane Sandy. This is actually the picture after Sandy, and I'll get into the details of it. But again, all these little tic-tac, amoeba-looking structures here, those are the subway cars. There's a big Navy barge, a trawler on its side, a tugboat here. Okay, and so we'll look. And this very raw-looking seafloor. This was from November 10th, so just about a little over a week after Hurricane Sandy came through. It's as early as we could get out. So we go out, we map with the AUV, we map with the ship. We use that to get our bathymetry and look at our acoustic signature of the seafloor. We have to ground truth those methods. We do those with a number of traditional and some new techniques using grab samplers to get samples of the seafloor. And again, here we see these two stark contrasts, fine sand and of course gravelly, poorly sorted sediment, like those two types I showed you from New Zealand. We use ROVs to get video and see what's living on the seafloor and go right up against the subway cars, or sometimes we get EPA divers come out with us and they like to still ride the subway cars, so they go inside for us. So once we have this data here is 500 kilohertz side scan backscatter mosaic using geocoder. So the areas in light here are higher amplitude return, and those tend to correlate with coarser, harder substrate. These are areas where we get our big ripples, and then the dark areas here are the fine sands. And you can see these subway cars. My PhD student Nicole just had a paper out in CSR. She goes into details about these and the temporal changes going back through 2008. We see some interesting effects. We see little halos of scour that form naturally around each of the subway cars. This is the same thing we studied with mines for the Navy. That's a typical process that happens around shipwrecks or any object on the seafloor. What's kind of interesting that happens is that when you get a number of these subway cars or any structures close enough together, is they sort of aggregate their scour pits. So they sort of this anastomosing process that they, instead of one small one around each, they get this larger aggregate. And the other interesting thing, this is only in 28 meters of water, and the conditions during storms can mobilize the entire seabed, and yet some of these larger contacts, these sharp acoustic contacts, like I showed you from that image from New Zealand, are persistent from year to year, which is kind of interesting. So once we take that backscatter, then we can use acoustic ground discrimination systems to actually, not to classify, but to segment an image acoustically into similar patches. And then we can use that to then decide where we want to go do our grab sampling. So we can say, okay, all these areas in purple acoustically look the same. Let's make sure we sample in those so we don't have to do that sort of blindly. And then we go in and we sample all these areas here in tan. And interestingly enough, the system actually, automated system actually picked up as a unique acoustic signature the subway cars and the barges and those sorts of things, which is kind of interesting. Okay. If I have time at the end, I'll show you in 3D. I have inflator maps where we can actually integrate all this information together. The bathymetry, surface measurements, and subsurface as well, where we're using subbottom profiler, and we can see where the barges and the subway cars are in here, they're up in here, and then we can see what acoustic layers from acoustic impedance, what internal layers they're kind of coming to rest on. Where we see those layers exposed, those are those coarse, gravelly shell hash layers. Okay. So that, just to give you that context of the area, to talk really about the storm dynamics. So along comes Hurricane Sandy, late October. Here's all the storms from last season. One of these is not like the other. I think what was very anomalous about Sandy is if you had seen this, if I just showed my students, a plot with a storm out here and asked them where do they think it was going to go, this left hook that it made at the end was what made it particularly unique, I guess, and it's also made us gave us pause for concern in Delaware because we were worried about it passing right over us, or particularly to the south, would have put the northeast section of the storm onto us. And we lucked out in that regard. It passed over Brigantine and Atlantic City, and that's why Manloking and central New Jersey got hit so much harder than Delaware did. So just to sort of put Sandy in context, here in red are the significant waves from Hurricane Sandy. Okay, this is as measured both by the offshore buoy 44009, and we got almost identical measurements from our in situ ADCP. Got up over 7 meters, about 7.5 meters in 28 meters of water. And now those waves had a period of 14 seconds. So the wavelengths are in excess of 200 meters in 28 meters of water, 1/10 of the depth. And I'll show you what that means for near bed orbital velocities. For comparison, those of you fans of film and literature, the Sebastian Junger book, The Perfect Storm, the movie, the 1991, the Halloween nor'easter, that's it at this area. During that time, it got up to about 4.5 meters, had a much shorter wave period, only about 8 seconds, So it had a much less effect of velocity near the bed. Now, if Sandy hadn't happened, I would be here today probably talking to you about two actually nor'easters. One, which is the fall nor'easter, so I've shifted two time records here. The red is from the fall, so red is Sandy, and then about a week after Sandy, we got a nor'easter. Interestingly, the same pattern happened in 1991. We had the perfect storm, and about a week later, another nor'easter. That's what happens that time of year when we get these more persistent nor'easters. Mid-Atlantic bite, New York bite. Nor'easters are storms of concern than hurricanes tend to be. So we had Sandy, boom, about a week later, we get this nor'easter that was 5.5 meters. It was actually bigger than the 91 storm. The nor'easter a week after Sandy. Early March, we were promised this, apocalyptic snowstorm in Delaware. We didn't get it. I think you guys may have got some more, New England got some more of it. But what it did offshore was it generated waves actually bigger than Sandy. Almost 8 meters, significant wave heights, shot up really quickly from that nor'easter, and interestingly stayed up much longer. Sandy had almost more of like a bell-shaped curve, ramped up, fell down. This nor'easter stayed up for quite a while, and that brought in a lot of swell. So it had almost 8 meter waves. That's significant wave height. So there's going to be ones even bigger than that. It's just the average of the highest 1/3. And it had wave heights over 3 meters high for about 4 days. And again, 12 to 14 second period. Now we might think, then people start saying, oh, well, these are, folks started calling out, oh, Sandy is a storm of a century. Well, I got a little issue with that because it's not. The conditions aren't. That's what they said that the Ash Wednesday storm, the 1962 storm, called the Great Atlantic Storm, the 5 high storm, the storm of the century. Well, that only happened 50 years ago. And I think when we start using these sort of storm of the century stuff, it's either we kind of confuse the public, or it's I think used as kind of a way to tune down the impact from a storm. But actually, if you look at the buoy records since '86, there have been over 28 events with a significant wave height of greater than 7 meters. That works out to a recurrence interval about 392 days, where you can expect to get a 7-meter wave once every 13 months, approximately. So that's not a 100-year recurrence interval. That's not a 50-year recurrence interval that we're getting from these nor'easters and Sandy. These are conditions that we can get kind of offshore. Obviously, the difference is these storms were coming ashore. They're bringing lots of surge and they're in direction with it. But we can get big events like this. Just to show you what it was then, what those waves meant for the seabed, we measured and calculated both directly from the PCADP and from linear wave theory using our wave records, and we can estimate the near bed orbital velocities. And these are expressed in meters per second. The blue line is the significant wave height, and gets up to about 7 meters. And the near bed orbital velocities get up to about 1.4, 1.5 meters per second. This means that the near bed orbital velocities were almost 3 knots, and they were swooshing back and forth every 14 seconds. We want to say, well, what does that do? What does that do to the seabed? Well, I'll show you what it does to the seabed. This is the picture from before Hurricane Sandy. This is October 26th, just a few days before the storm. I had a 4-day cruise. The Shark wanted to get out of Dodge and get refuge in Delaware Bay, and they were very responsive. And I said, please, just give me just a day. And so we went out, and in a day we deployed instruments, mapped this area, grabbed samples, and got the heck out of Dodge. And if you'll see the same area, again, here's our subway cars, here's a Navy barge. It looks pretty smooth and featureless in here. We actually have these are real features, these are hummocky beds. This is 25 centimeter gridded bathymetry. There's about 8 million points going into this. Very tightly spaced lines. There's a few hiatus points in there where we had bubble sweep because the conditions were already kind of getting a little rough. So that's the before picture. I'll let the picture do the talking. Here's after. Before and after. So you can see the large lee scour marks that we get from the waves coming in the lee of these objects. And when we zoom in, I'll show you, you can actually see on the subway cars where the doors and windows were, those openings, because it was like somebody put a fire hose through there. Our hummocky beds, notice they're gone.
Excuse me, which way is north?
North is up. North is up.
So then why is the wake heading to the southwest.
heading to the
And the
southwest.
waves would be coming in from where? What direction?
Well, the storm passed north of us. So we were on the south side of it. Well, a lot of the winds were blowing down the bay, but this was generating big swell out to sea. And then as it was clocking around and passing us to the north, we had well, there's two factors here. This isn't just, I say it's after Sandy, but it's actually after Sandy and the smaller nor'easter. So we actually have two events here. We couldn't get out in between the two. So 7-meter waves from Sandy, and then 5-meter waves from that nor'easter. And yeah, by definition, I mean a nor'easter is northeasterly winds. So we've got an imprint of kind of two.
Is the depositional region for that scoured material downstream of it there? Down there?
Yeah. So we've got 1.5 meter per second oscillatory flows near the bed, and throughout the water column, up to 60 to 80 centimeters per second of mean flows during the storm.
Okay, so the waves are suspending the sediment.
Yep.
And then the
Waves pick it up,
surge
currents.
of that was actually moving it.
That's right. Here's a close-up. Again, so this is October 26th, before Sandy. Here's our subway cars. Kind of smooth, kind of a little hummocky. You can see the clear scour marks around. Here's a subway car that's largely disintegrated. Some of them have been falling apart and
How deep is
collapsing.
that scour pit?
Yeah, it's like I'll show you that. It's about a meter, yeah, half a meter to a meter or so, relative to the ambient seabed. It's not consistent across. It's particularly more pronounced near the windows, which I'll show you. So that's before. That's after. Okay, so it's let me go back to that one again. Before, after. This coarse sand, when developed in these large wave orbital ripples, they're responding to the wave direction. So we know that the approach as well. Enhanced scour around us, and these finer sand areas have been very much scoured away and modeled. That's November 10th. Then we went back out in December, and you already start to see some recovery going on. Do that, those two, there to there. So the finer sands are more easily mobilized and getting transported. So some of these ripples, they get bioturbated and they get filled in. Yeah, and then just to sort of follow up here, we're going to look in this domain at a particular subway car over here. There's a cluster of them. We'll focus on this one over here. And here's the subway car and the scour around it. And that's what happened to it afterwards. The storms, I should say, rotated and blasted out this subway car. In fact, we can see some of that stuff. Just have a little scene right here. We can take a look at a couple of subway cars here. Yeah. So here's our entries in there, and you can see these particular pits around where the doors are. If I zoom in, I can actually get a measure of that, what those scour pits look like. Okay, so that's about, maybe these are in meters here, so half a meter to a meter around it on that side. Some of the spots are a little deeper, might be more like half a meter, so half a meter or so is about what the scour is around those. So I really want to understand these ripples and bed forms, and a couple of years ago, sort of inspired by some work that one of Larry Mayer's students was doing, Janice Felsenberger, she was looking at ripples inside larger tidal bed forms inside Portsmouth Harbor, and she was using some techniques looking at fingerprint analysis. And so my student Adam and I dug into the literature, and I had a family member who during the war was a fingerprint. They used to have people identifying those. And so, basically, it turns out there's a pretty robust literature and analysis for fingerprints, and there's a lot that we felt that we could borrow for that and apply it to ripples, because this is what a fingerprint looks like. This is what a rotary sonar scan of the seafloor, and it turns out it has quite a number of advantages over other traditional techniques, like we've used manual counts and 2D fast Fourier transform, FFT analysis. What we want to try to get at for hydrodynamic, morphodynamic studies is we want to quantify bed forms. Pretty qualitative pictures aren't so useful for us. We want to extract quantitative information. We want to know the wavelength, the crest-to-crest distance of ripples. We want to know their height. Can't do that from side scan, but we can do the height. Well, we sort of can. We can look at shadow, or we can use bathymetry and try to get it at height. And from a hydrodynamic standpoint, it's really the steepness, some measure of the ratio of the height to the wavelength that really determines the hydrodynamic roughness. And so what we do is we borrowed and modified some fingerprint identification code that has a number of benefits, and if anybody's interested, I can provide you a lot more details. And one of the things is that fingerprint algorithms are designed to find unique identifying little areas, bifurcations, or ridge endings on your, I'm going to be staring at your finger sometime, you'll see those little bifurcations endings. Ripples have those same things. And these are one of the unique factors used to identify people's fingerprints. And folks interested in bed forms have for a number of years theorized and we call those in ripples, we call them defects, ripple defects. And folks have suggested various roles that those might play, or various processes that those might be basically representing for ripples. But it's been hard to try to, how do you extract those without having to try to have somebody go in and find all those. So it turns out that the fingerprint algorithm techniques help us to do that. They help eliminate areas of an image that are chaotic and don't have ripples associated with them because of the orientation of the sonars. When you're insonifying across ripples, you get really nice images. If you're trying to insonify it along them, you don't see the bed forms. It's like shining a flashlight over corrugated surface. You shine across, you'll see the light and dark. You shine along, it won't be as responsive. So what the process is, we take our side scan image, same if this was a fingerprint image, we binarize it, then we winnow it away, we thin it down, it allows us to extract the wave crests, and then we look at those joins. We can then isolate the joins and the defect areas. The ridge endings, we can find those, and we can find the defects. So for a section of an image, we can get orientation, we can get wavelength, and then we can get these defect densities. And so this is what we suggested to the Navy, is that one of the uses, one of the valuable aspects of this fingerprint approach is that it's filtering out parts of the image for you. Typically, it's to find ridges, so we can use it to mask our sonar and just focus on the areas that have ripples. So it masks out areas where there are subway cars and other non-linear features in it. But you might also ask the other question, so well, maybe you're really interested in non-ripples in rippled areas. Maybe it's a target. Maybe you left some instrument on the seafloor. Maybe it's part of a subway car. So if you invert that mask, you can actually sort of highlight areas within a mapping field that might be targets that you might want to then further prosecute or explore or examine. So what this technique allows us to do is take a side scan image like this and extract the ripple wavelength, filter out the areas that don't have ripples in it, and we can get the wavelength measurement. This is in meters. So I can see where in a ripple field are the biggest ripples. And is there something systematic about it? Something we really haven't been able to do before when we've looked at these large sorted bed-form features, is to really look at how do they vary in their morphology, or do they vary in their morphology? We ask the null hypothesis, perhaps. We can look at wavelength throughout that system. With the bathymetry, we could actually look at ripple height. This is actually modeled ripple height based on assumed steepness of ripples. They tend to have a pretty, turns out you can do pretty well if you can measure the wavelength at estimating the ripple steepness. They tend to have about a 0.17 times the wavelength. So we're still working on how we can directly measure the ripple height from the bathymetry, but if I take the wavelength and just apply a steepness factor, I can look at how the height varies. I can then look at how the roughness varies as parameterized. This is a formula that, well, Madsen suggested that you can parameterize ripple roughness. This is what gets stuck into a hydrodynamic model when you're trying to use it to do sediment transport or wave occurrences. Typically, roughness is a tuning factor in the models, but you can have a steepness from the ripples. You can have a roughness from ripples. The grains themselves introduce a roughness. And what you see is the areas that are fine sand are almost 2 orders of magnitude smoother in terms of their roughness to the large rippled areas. Again, that's consistent with what we've seen in other areas where we see this difference between the rippled and the smooth areas. And so that sets up a steep gradient in turbulence, in that when sediments are put in suspension, that fine sands are going to get advected by, they're not going to be able to settle over this really rough bed because it's just too turbulent. Again, it allows us to interrogate and look at patterns around, scour around objects. It might be, maybe we use that to try to, figure out where, what's causing this. Maybe it leads us back to an object. So we're trying to look at detailed patterns, not only the wavelength, but the orientation, try to get some better sense of how the flow is interacting with objects in different orientations and different sizes. And then we're also using this data to be able to do field tests of predictive models for ripples. And there's a number of models out there, predictive equations like Wiberg and Harris that predict wave ripple characteristics based on orbital diameters and grain size. And I won't bother you through this, but if you looked at we measured our hydrodynamics on the site. If we look at a Shields parameter, the dimensionless measure of the stresses on the bed, this is the stresses at the bed from Hurricane Sandy and then that nor'easter. And if you look at what the critical Shields parameter is, that's just the threshold you have to pass in order to entrain and mobilize sediment. And you can see, of course, the storms really exceeds that. In between, it drops below, so you'd expect no transport in between the events. And then I've modeled this, basically estimated this for different grain sizes. Fine sands, 0.3 millimeters up to 1.5 millimeters, that very coarse sand, almost gravel. And if you actually predicted the ripple wavelengths, of course, you would predict in an equilibrium model like the Wiberg-Harris model that the ripples should get up to around 1.8 meters per second in the coarse domains. In the fine domains, it goes to plain bed, so they're wiped out. But what's interesting is what we see preserved are the ripples on the waning edge of the storm, because they essentially get locked in. As the storm conditions go up, the ripples, they get bigger and bigger in the coarse domain, and then as the conditions subside, they essentially they lock in, and then they'll get exposed to different bioturbation and secondary working. So we expect actually to get the ripple condition should be on that waning part of the storm. So the model isn't too far off in its wavelength relative to what we're seeing. It's just what you see is not the peak part of the storm. The ripples are still adjusting in a little bit of the waning part of the storm. So my goal here is to show you that, hopefully emphasize for you that complex texture and roughness dominate shelf systems. And I picked on this one, but there's many others I could have chosen. That we see these dynamic ripples and scour patterns, especially during storms and around these objects. That for Sandy we had really big conditions, but conditions that we can get out of the inner shelf side, 7 meter significant wave, 14-second period, orbital velocities almost 3 knots. And then we can use AUVs as platforms for measuring, looking at this very high precision, high resolution bed form morphology and related to the hydrodynamics, and particularly by using some of these new fingerprint techniques. I think I've drove it on maps. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. How does your the erosion parameters that you calculated compare to the actual grain size? Are you using?
I'm using I'm using D50 median grain sizes from our grab sample data that we send off to be analyzed.
So are those disaggregated sediments, or are they?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, but in nature they might be coarser, right? Because they're stuck together, particles are stuck together, or is that not?
There is a little bit of a fine fraction because of the. It's called the mud hole, and I think that these are what we see is there are some fine silt, clay silt layers in there from the ancestral river. I think it was an over levee deposit, like a splay. And that can have so there are some areas in there that are kind of cohesive. which is unique on the shelf. I mean, it's because it's exposing an older deposit, palimpsest deposit. So I didn't include a cohesive factor.
You don't think that influences it?
I mean, it does for some of these areas where it really scours down and gets to this kind of cohesive play, but I'm like kind of a non-cohesive guy, so I was ignoring that. So yes.
A couple of times you invoked bioturbation for
Yes.
for relatively quickly diminishing some of the ripples and features. These are areas where there's an awful lot of erosion, sometimes of habitat. So could you tell us something about your intuition of what critters you're talking about in some of these environments? Are these deep-wing buried clams that are holding on during the storms?
Yeah. I should tag a clam to see how it does during the storm. Well, I'm stepping a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. That's why I work with a benthic ecologist in Doug Miller. So we do find we find epi and infaunal species worms in the sediment, and the kind of bioturbation that we get on the shelf can happen from some of those infauna. It could be from clams, and we get some of it from horseshoe crabs running around the seafloor as well. And that there just tends to be, both for biological and physical reasons, that ripples once formed kind of go through a decay process. Because even though the conditions generally drop down below threshold, waves and currents can still kind of sort of they go from being spiked to being sort of rounded. I know with and this is why unfortunately our rotary sonar wasn't working for us, but when we've had that on, we can see crabs and mollusks crawling across the surfaces. So I hope that's sufficient. I have to punt that. Yes.
Yeah, back to your fingerprinting technique, when you calculated the roughness,
Yes.
the eta squared of a lambda, how does that compare to the ground truth?
So those wavelengths were our measured sort of wavelengths from the side scan and the bathymetry.
But the eta was estimated from the wavelength.
Yeah, eta is estimated. I've been able to look a little bit at the wave at the height, because I can actually go into the. Let me give you an example here. I can go into here, and I can here's now a profile across some ripples. Okay, so these are in 2 centimeter units. Okay, so that's 2, 4, 6. These are maybe 8 centimeter high. But it's hard when you're dealing with gridded multi-beam bathymetry to look at ripples, because your average. I've got a 25 centimeter cell, and so I'm averaging it. So it tends to reduce the highs and bring in the lows. So we know that from our gridded bathymetry that our measurement of their amplitude is a bit under predicting. That's under measuring, just because of the gridding process. Because my window is capturing part of a. Now I've got a real feature like this, but I've got a bit box here, so it's going to be averaging some of these, all of those points to get a point. So the gridded data is 8 million points. So now I'm having to go back into the ungridded data to try to see how we can get the estimates of the amplitude. So it's not. So this is smaller. They should be up in like the 15 to 20 centimeter high. And part of that is it's just one, we have some, unless we're right out there right after. Part of it is this, again, bioturbation, physical changes to the ripples. Wavelength is much more better preserved than ripple height. It has a larger order of magnitude, so it's just going to be better preserved. But height is very important. So.
If the rotating sonar was working, then that would give you.
Exactly. Yeah. So we typically use that. Now that, again, it's a 2D system that we have. So we look at the shadow length to get a
One more? Okay.
So you showed a lot of redistribution and
Yep.
a long shelf dynamics associated with these storm events. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's much cross shelf transport at all associated with them.
So, I mean, I think if you look at where some of those scour marks were, those were kind of in a west-south-westerly, you know, so there's cross shelf component there. As far as, you know, offshore, the conditions that we had at this site with the winds most of the day blowing from the northwest would favor an upwelling. So that would favor, you know, towards the shore transport. So we're now working with some modelers to try to bring some of this data in so they can model it over the larger. You know, we have a little postage stamp that we're looking at. But under these conditions, with the winds and the currents, was more of a conducive for an upwelling transport. And that varies as the storms move through.
Thank you very much, and anyone else can